Greetings. So I was reading a bunch of stuff on the Colorado River and I ended up in a rabbit hole about the state of Colorado itself, which got me into another rabbit hole about the city of Denver and its history. Specifically Denver's early history around the 1860s, right after it was founded. It really seems like the more I read about it, the stuff got crazier and crazier as it got, and I just needed to talk about it. To make the story flow better, I will cover the founding of the city as well. Alright, let's get started. First of all, there are going to be details that I have to leave out to prevent this from being 2 hours long, but if any big experts want to add details, then please share in the comments. So our story starts with the Colorado Gold Rush in 1858. This period was a decade after the Mexican-American War and just a few years before the American Civil War. Colorado was in an interesting position at this time. It was split between many different territories, like the Kansas Territory and the Utah Territory. The land that would become the city of Denver was on the edge of the Kansas Territory in a zone called the Arapahoe County, which got its name from the Arapahoe people, who were one of the two dominant Amerindian groups in the area, along with the Cheyenne people. The Cheyenne and the Arapahoe have an entire history with the American military after the Louisiana Purchase, but all we need to know right now is that before the 1858 gold rush, they were the main population of the area, along with other smaller tribes. The Colorado Gold Rush started when a man named William Greenberry Russell found gold near the South Platte River, which is this river here. People had been sporadically finding gold near the South Platte River and in the Rockies for some time now, but this was the first real publicized finding. There's this excellent story of a man named John Cantrell who wanted to promote the gold rush, so he took a big bag of sand from the bed of the South Platte River and traveled all the way to Kansas City. He opened the bag and started panning gold from it right in front of a huge crowd. And when they saw him get a bunch of gold flakes from the sand, they went totally nuts. Over 100,000 Americans and some European migrants streamed into the area over the next few years. And despite a few people getting rich, most people didn't get much, and the hype train ran straight off a cliff. However, this big hype train around the South Platte River is what created Denver. In the summer of 1858, a bunch of men seeking gold established small settlements around the area. A lot of these places started out as just campsites with a bunch of tents around it, but in order to make their claims actually permanent in the area, they had to quickly throw together a bunch of log cabins. Because none of these guys knew what the winters were like in Colorado, they made the educated guess that it might be better to leave for the winter and come back in the spring of 1859 instead of trying to find out how cold it would get. So each group made their boundaries of their settlements clear, and then they left. One settlement called Aurora, not to be confused with modern Aurora, which is completely different, was populated by miners living in similar cabins, which were positioned next to a small creek called Cherry Creek. On the other side of the creek was a plot of land called St. Charles. The miners who were setting up shop in St. Charles also had no idea how bad things would get during the winter of Colorado, so they also went east before things got chilly. They left behind a guy named Charles to guard St. Charles with a few others, just to make sure nothing happened to their stuff. By the way, yes, I know he's the same name as the place he was guarding. I'm sure they knew this, and I'm sure it was hilarious when he was assigned the role. Anyways, one day in November, a charismatic veteran named William Larimer showed up in the area, looking to found a settlement of his own. He had a bunch of guys with him that were described as well-armed. They had been looking for a good spot to settle down in for several days at this point. Larimer saw the St. Charles plot of land and walked up to Charles, who hadn't even finished his cabin yet, and started issuing demands to him on the spot. After some chaos, the two groups started proper negotiations. These negotiations included bribing the miners with a barrel of whiskey, and Larimer threatening to hang them if they resisted. Due to the power imbalance of the situation, Charles and the miners had no choice, and they gave up the St. Charles land to Larimer and his friends. After conquering their new territory next to Aurora, Larimer got to developing his new settlement. He had big ambitions for the place, and he was hoping to make it the county seat of the Arapahoe County. So he named his settlement after the Kansas Territory governor, James William Denver, officially founding the city of Denver. Unfortunately for the Larimer party, James Denver had actually retired from the governorship a few weeks before this, so he had no say in where the county seat would be. So, in the end, the city of Denver got its name from a guy who had nothing to do with it, and they just stuck with the name, I guess. Also, James Denver later found out about the city, and in the 1880s and 1890s, he visited. And what is hilarious is that despite being super invested in the success of the city, because of course he was, it was literally named after him, there were several occasions where he would be invited to visit, he would travel all the way there, and when he arrived, there would be no one to greet or talk to him. In one of his letters, he basically talks about how he liked the city, but the people there kept ghosting him, and he was really getting sick of it. As the settlement of Denver grew, it became a fierce rival to the Aurora settlement right across the creek. They competed over people looking for gold and people looking to start businesses. One thing they fought bitterly over was getting the first newspaper in the area. One day an editor named William Byers arrived and set up shop in Aurora, creating the Rocky Mountain News. But once he found out about the intense situation between Denver and Aurora, he decided to put his newspaper building in the middle of the small creek in between the two settlements. The building was elevated off the ground so the flow of the creek wasn't disrupted, so I'm sure it was fine. Surely this creek would never see any large amount of water. Surely not. Something to note was that the western US at this time was pretty lawless, and people in settlements like Denver and Aurora had to take things into their own hands when things got crazy. There was a conflict during 1859, and I'm not making this up, called the Turkey War. There was a group of outlaws called the Bummer Gang that committed petty crime everywhere they went. This gang was infamous in the area and their misdeeds, and pretty much everyone hated them. One day they robbed a wagon full of turkeys, and it was the last straw for the population. The people rose up and got help from a group called the Jefferson Rangers, and together they drove out the bummers, and it ended pretty quickly. Although I am sorry to inform you that there were no armed turkeys involved in any of this. So the year is 1860, and a lot has changed. Denver has scored a big win over Aurora and has gotten access to an important route for stagecoaches. Remember that despite being in Colorado, which is known for its mountains, Denver is actually within the Great Plains, and back then rest stops for people traveling through the dry grasslands were absolutely necessary. A growing Denver was able to provide a place of sanctuary for travelers and gold seekers headed west or east. Aurora eventually merges with Denver during all this, so to avoid confusion, I'm just going to refer to it all as Denver. The settlement at this point, much to Mr. Larimer's delight, had grown into a real town of more than 4,000 people. There were families and businesses and brand new churches, and after a man skilled with bricks arrived, the place started to get buildings made of something other than wood. However, there was obvious issues with the place. First of all, this town was essentially 75% male due to the nature of its existence. Denver was created from the gold-searching men looking for wealth in the area and in the mountains, so it meant that the town had a higher than average amount of antisocial individuals and just straight up outlaws. Basically, it was disturbingly close to the Wild West town stereotype, just with beautiful mountains in the background and a snowy winter. Also, unfortunately for the people of Denver and for Mr. Larimer, the gold rush was ending, and many people who were staying in Denver just for the prospects of gold lost any reason to stay and started to leave. This all caused the town to stop growing and the economy to slump. And on the horizon, dark clouds were brewing. In 1861, the Civil War began. Business and opportunity in Denver came to a sudden halt as the country and economy were mobilized for war. Many sympathizers of the Confederacy were driven out of the town due to the majority of the population being from northern states. Enforcing common law had always been difficult in the area, but once the war started, help from any government resources became very rare. Crimes went unpunished, and sometimes, in order to get some kind of justice, people resorted to mob rule, and criminals would be captured and hanged without trial. Many men in Denver became a part of the Colorado Volunteer Militia, which fought at the Battle of Glorieta Pass, which the founder of Phoenix, Arizona, Jack Swilling, was also a part of. So I thought that was cool. In 1861, the Colorado Territory was formed, and Denver was briefly made the capital. Larimer played a big role in getting the territory organized, but Apparently, he was expecting to be made the governor of the new territory, and Abraham Lincoln left him on red and made some guy named Gilpin the governor instead. Well, I say some guy named Gilpin. Gilpin was an incredibly skilled man who would go on to raise the Colorado Volunteers, so maybe he was a better choice. Larimer was super bummed out from all of this, and he pretty much fades from Denver's story from here on out, which is ridiculous because Larimer is literally the founder of the city, and he was abandoning it when things were just getting bad, all because he got his feelers hurt by the president. Whatever. 1862 was a pretty uneventful year for Denver, despite a few scares of a possible approaching Confederate army. People were pretty miserable, however, and all the Wild West shenanigans you can imagine happening were happening constantly. This was also the year Gilpin was replaced by a man named John Evans as the territory governor. You might be wondering what's happening to the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes at this point, but don't worry, we'll get to them. In 1863, things got bad, really bad. A huge fire consumed the center of the town, and people frantically tried doing what they could to limit its spread. A year earlier, they had created a band of firefighters, but they had no training and no supplies, so they were basically just a group of guys. Unfortunately, the fire had started in the early morning, so people were still asleep when it was burning. Over 100 businesses and 70 buildings were turned to ash, and it didn't help that a lot of the town was still just log cabins. Thankfully, no one died in the fire due to its initial slow growth, and it would lead to brick buildings becoming the standard over the old wooden ones. One fact was clear in the aftermath, though. The town's economy was at rock bottom after so many businesses were destroyed. It was somehow more over than previously thought possible. But the residents did what they could to slowly rebuild and recover. The ones who weren't just there for money, but because it was their new home, took up the responsibility of reconstructing the town. Then, less than a year later in 1864, high amounts of snowmelt sent a tidal wave of water down the creek that went through the city. The Rocky Mountain News building that had been purposely built on top of the creek was sent into orbit and never seen again. Dozens of buildings, including the Methodist Church, were destroyed, and many people found themselves homeless after the flood. We actually have many pictures of the aftermath of this flood, which I thought was interesting. You get a good glimpse of the past here. Things had truly gotten bleak for Denver at this point. The red line of their economy could not go down any further, and the Wild West drunkenness, deviancy, and violence reached an all-time high. The residents of Denver, however, shrugged their shoulders again and started to rebuild again. You've got to give it to these people. They are hard as nails. Very different to the modern Denver people who are quite soft and frail. And then, right after this, a literal swarm of local grasshoppers descended upon the area in a gigantic swarm, and they, I quote, devoured all vegetation in sight. It's like the 10 plagues of Egypt. Just imagine being one of these people, and you are just experiencing all this and wondering how you even got to this point. This is all happening on top of the Civil War that is consuming the entire country, by the way, which, granted, by 1864 and 65 was wrapping up at this point, but it really does feel like a never-ending ride of chaos. Thankfully, because Denver was more of a commerce-based town than an agricultural-based one, the lack of plants really didn't doom them. It just worsened an already desperate situation for the people who, at this point, were probably slowly going insane. The year 1864 also marked the year of the Sand Creek Massacre, which is a total mess I will now attempt to explain. The Arapaho and Cheyenne people had a tense but peaceful relationship with the people of Denver. For the first few years of the new Governor John Evans' leadership, the cooperation with the local tribes was somewhat productive, but everyone was on edge. First of all, the Civil War and the various disasters in Denver were really affecting the psychology of everyone. Secondly, the several revolts from Amerindian tribes in places like Minnesota had made the settlers fearful of what the tribes next door would do. Not to mention the stories of hellish violence in places like Arizona and New Mexico with the Apache. Due to issues with getting good sources of food, men from the Aparajo and Cheyenne started raiding wagons traveling through the land. One day, 4 young Aparajo men carried out one of these raids and gave into their bloodlust and ended up brutally murdering an entire settler family. Notably, the father's body had 80 bullet holes, and details like this totally spooked Denver and other nearby towns into a panic. After everyone had learned about the incident, a dialogue was started between the tribesmen and the governor. But due to the pleas from farmers and scared settlers, John Evans decided to side with them and stalled talks in order to raise the 3rd Colorado Regiment, commanded by John Chivington, a man who fought at the Battle of Glorieta Pass that I mentioned earlier. Chivington's goal was to subdue hostile men from the Aparajo and Cheyenne tribes and reduce the threat of raids. However, the Amerindians were not as hostile as John Evans had believed, so for 2 straight months, Chivington's cavalry didn't fight a single engagement, which frustrated his men. After failing to find any threat, Chivington and his men were in a psychological position that history has seen many armies be in. Usually when a whole army is frustrated and feel humiliated, they will lash out and their brutality will multiply 100 times. Much like Caesar's army at the siege of Avaricum, where the soldiers were put through hell in order to take the city, once they got inside, Caesar lost control of his men, and the army did unspeakable things within it. It was the same thing here. Chivington's small force was frustrated, and once an opportunity popped up, there would be no one to stop them from doing what they wanted. In the region, there was a group of traveling Cheyenne and Aparajo elders, children and women. They had left an American fort after some miscommunication, and Chivington's force found out about them. Their cavalry surprise attacked the traveling group at a place called Sand Creek. They killed about 150 people. Ironically, most of the actual warriors that Chivington had been after this whole time escaped unharmed during the incident. When people learned about the massacre, the mood changed again. Proper investigations were made against Chivington, several soldiers, and the governor, and this event essentially ruined their lives. Denver was placed under martial law, and unsurprisingly, the Aparajo and Cheyenne people were not on speaking terms anymore with the American government. All the careful negotiations with the Amerindians that had been built up over decades had been destroyed in one day, and now Colorado was at war with the Cheyenne and Aparajo. Thanks to this disastrous military situation, the poor city of Denver now had to deal with daily raids and pillaging from all the neighboring tribes. This was along with the now implemented martial law in the city, and not to mention all the aftermath of the previous disasters. And the city wasn't even 10 years old yet, the absolute state. The population had declined to barely 3,000 people, and the economy was basically non-existent. It really seemed like this was the end. Denver was finished. But right when things were at their worst, the Civil War ended, and the U.S. economy demobilized. And the end of the war was like a bolt of lightning that shot through the town, giving it power. People began to move west again. Veterans from the war moved into the private sector and started businesses. People started looking for gold again in the Rocky Mountains. The end of the war also brought law and order to the territory, which meant a decline in raids and crime. Residents of the town found themselves making good money again due to the movement of people and resources, which gave them the power to finish rebuilding and invest. And the most important detail that changed everything were the railroads. In 1868, ground broke for the first railroad through Denver that would connect it to the Pacific and the East. The ease of movement that the trains created remade Denver's economy, and the population of the town doubled by the 1870s. Anyways, that's the story of how the city of Denver somehow didn't die. Obviously, there's a lot more about all this and a lot more after this, but I'm going to leave it off here. I hope you enjoyed. My video making skills are improving every day, so subscribe if you want to see more. Anyways, thanks.